Thank you for joining today's virtual briefing hosted by the Natural Security Campaign, a collaboration among 4 leading conservation organizations. This is the kickoff event in a series of 3 natural security programs that will be held over the coming weeks. My name is Rod Schoonover, and I spent a decade as a senior scientist in the US intelligence community, analyzing the national security implications of environmental and ecological change. The connections between natural world degradation and US national security interests are clear. When criminals profit from the poaching and trafficking of wildlife, timber, and natural resources, they rob communities of their natural wealth, undermine the rule of law, enable corruption, and distort markets. And these activities have cascading effects on the economic security of our nation and economic livelihoods of citizens here at home. And sometimes these ill-gotten resources fund bad actors that seek to sow chaos and overthrow governments. And shortages of fresh water, food, and arable land, and other natural resources can contribute to political instability, social unrest, conflict, and disruptive migration. And the US intelligence community has long warned about the economic damage, political instability, and social disruption that can and do arise from global pandemics, such as what we are experiencing right now with COVID-19. And that's the topic of today's discussion. How can we better understand zoonotic spillover from animals to humans with the aim of arresting the next pandemic before it starts? So I'm joined this morning by 3 fantastic panelists from the World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, and Conservation International. They'll walk us through an overview of the science behind the drivers of zoonotic spillover, to characterizing various aspects of zoonotic disease when they occur, and finally a look into changing biodiversity in the human-wildlife interface. Each of our panelists will go for about 8 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a live Q&A. So please submit your questions below the video player as you listen to our speakers, or you can email questions to info@naturalsecurity.us. So first up, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Rebecca Shaw, Chief Scientist and Senior Vice President at the World Wildlife Fund. In that role, Dr. Shaw works with many staff and partners around the world to identify the most important scientific questions that challenge effective conservation and advance solutions to those challenges. Today, she is going to provide a high-level overview of the science behind various drivers of zoonotic spillover and look at the root causes of pandemics. So Dr. Shaw, please take it away.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to give a quick overview. We developed at WWF just a science brief to help folks know what it was that gives rise to emerging infectious diseases and how conservation can reduce the likelihood or severity of a zoonotic event in the future. So this is really forward-looking. Before we dive deeper though, I want to make sure that everybody understands a spillover is when a pathogen passes from an animal to a human, wild or domestic animal. And a pathogen can be a virus, a bacteria, a fungus, or a parasite. And that's important to know because there are many ways in which humans can get wildlife diseases. This graph shows the cumulative number of viruses identified each year and the rise in the significant spillover events in the last 60 years. Approximately 2 viruses have been discovered each year, and the number of spillover events is increasing. And you can see, and you will recognize many of these diseases, particularly SARS, Ebola, and COVID. Many are recommending simple fixes, such as the closure of all wet markets. But to be credible in the connection between the health of people and the health of nature and natural security, we need the evidence to support a bold strategy that delivers on the health of both. So understanding what triggers these spillovers is critically important. If you look back at the last 60 years, you'll find that the majority of emerging diseases are zoonotic, 75%. Not all zoonotic diseases come from Asia. That's very important to know. The majority of zoonotic diseases have a domestic livestock animal as an intermediate host that passed the pathogen onto humans. And for most diseases, bats, lots of the diseases, bats are confirmed or suspected as the origin of the pathogen. Bats have a special immune system that allows them to carry viruses without contracting the diseases. And this way, they are reservoirs for the diseases. To identify a role for conservation, we need to understand the drivers of disease emergence and how conservation interventions could make a difference. But it is important in doing this, to understand that not all drivers of the diseases are the same. And the dynamics are really specific to the diseases, including the host of the pathogen and the host of and how the pathogen transmits. So we're going to go really quickly into a deep dive into a range of pathogens that are important. This graphic, although it looks complicated, is not. It shows you on the very left-hand side the different kinds of disease transmission. It shows you in orange the host or the reservoir species. It shows you in gray how the diseases transmit to humans. And then in black, it shows you how when the human infection, whether it can become transmitted between humans to humans. And this is where we really focus, because it is that transmission from human to humans that allow for a disease to become pandemics. Many of these other diseases are very important, but we really focused on what allows for something to become a pandemic. And in green, you'll see the drivers of zoonotic diseases. One thing you'll notice right away is that land use change is the direct driver in all 7 pathogen types. And you also noted that the first 3 pathogen types have climate change as a direct driver, and this is because climate change affects the geographic range of the host, such as West Nile virus. And you'll notice that bats are really important in the transmission of diseases. And this includes the 7th pathway where coronaviruses sit. And there have been 3 outbreaks in the last 20 years, SARS, MERS, and COVID-19 and Ebola that have that kind of look. So let's zoom into the diseases of the study, just so that we're really clear. We're focused on these zoonotic pathogen types that transmit from humans to humans. And again, note that land use change, expansion and intensification of livestock production, exploitation of wildlife are the main drivers of the coronavirus spillover events. So if we want to look at the risk of disease emergence associated with these drivers, understanding the relationship between the drivers and disease emergence allows us to better understand how we can reduce that risk. While it's very hard to know precisely the origin of the zoonotic disease spillover, we do know that with more scientific certainty that with rapid rise in zoonotic events over the last 30 years has been driven by, first, wildlife exploitation. We are now farming, trafficking, trading, selling live wild animals for food, medicine, pets, and status at levels we've never seen before. This has brought humans and live wild animals into contact in increasing, dramatically increasing the risk of disease transmission and spillover. The expansion and intensification of livestock on that wildlife frontier, where particularly in tropical zones, we are also increasing the risk. We are farming, transporting, and selling domestic animals in ways we haven't been before, and we're doing so in close proximity to wildlands, and in many countries, we are farming wildlife. Again, when we put domestic livestock farms next to wild animals and wild habitats without the appropriate biosecurity measures, we're increasing the risk of the spillover. And also land use change. We are destroying more and more natural habitat, particularly tropical forests, and converting it to agriculture. And it is at deforestation fronts where we see the first exchanges between livestock and wildlife and humans. Again, bringing humans, domestic animals, and wildlife in contact in ways we've never seen before. Each of these drivers increases the proximity and intensity of the interaction between live wild animals and live domestic animals and humans. And since pathogens, particularly viruses, are constantly mutating in an arms race to survive, the increased frequency of the human-animal interactions make it more likely that a human will be present when a mutation occurs that would allow for a pathogen to spread and thrive in humans. It's kind of a numbers game. And of course, the current COVID-19 pandemic is devastating in many ways. However, it is a bit of a warning shot. This virus has a high transmission rate, but relatively low mortality rate compared to other zoonotic diseases such as Ebola. If a zoonotic disease was to combine high transmission rates during the asymptomatic phase of the disease in humans with higher fatality rates, the consequences would be more devastating. Again, it's a numbers game amplified by increased frequency of interaction between humans, wildlife, through a complex and interacting global supply chain. And I want to make sure that we don't reduce this, we reduce probability of spillover. We will have to tackle, we will have to make sure that we do so. We do so by looking at the demand for food. And this just shows you quickly an amplifying risk along the supply chain from the tropical deforestation front through to rural markets, local markets, and regional markets. And we see amplifying risk and shedding of viruses as we go through there and the mixing of humans. There are lots of things we can do in conservation, including stopping deforestation, reforming the way we grow we raise live wild animals where we do it with biosecurity measures, and of course, stopping the trade and sale of exotic wildlife for meat and for pets across the globe. So with that, I'll push it back to Rob, and I look forward to answering questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Shaw, for that excellent presentation. That was very informative, scary, especially the reminder that COVID-19 is really a warning shot. I think that's a very sobering observation. So our second panelist is Dr. Chris Waltzer, the Executive Director of Wildlife Health at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Dr. Waltzer has an internationally recognized diverse expertise in working with wildlife and has authored more than 70 peer-reviewed research publications, numerous book chapters, and he lectures widely in the field of wildlife health and biodiversity conservation. Today, he'll discuss various characteristics of zoonotic disease with additional focus on the One Health approach and the USAID PREDICT program. So Dr. Waltzer, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rod, for that introduction. I can't see my screen yet. No, I can't. Thanks very much for that. And good morning from the Bronx. I hope everyone's staying well, healthy, and sane. And thanks very much for this invitation. Thanks also to Dr. Shaw for setting this up and providing the background. So I'm not going to spend much time on this. You've heard about zoonosis moving between animals and humans. I just want to make it clear that they also move both ways. And at the moment, we actually have 3 ongoing pandemics. 2 of those are animal livestock pandemics. One is African swine fever, which I'm sure you've all heard of. The other one is not as well known as the peste petit ruminant, which is decimating goat and sheep populations across Central Asia and wildlife, which have great impacts on the livelihood of people who depend on those. And as Dr. Shaw has said, the frequency is increasing. And I just want to bring your attention to this example. There have been 11 outbreaks of Ebola virus in the Democratic Republic of Congo. 8 of those occurred in the last 13 years and 4 alone since 2018. And one of them is still ongoing at the moment, as you know, in Eastern DRC, and that is actually expanding. So this is a very, very clear signal. When we look at SARS coronavirus 2, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, we agree there's broad consensus of zoonotic origin, in a horseshoe bat species, and this is really no surprise. People have been talking about this for years, warning of this. What is unclear actually is the timing, the place, and the mechanism of spillover. That's often the case, that we don't know exactly where the index case was, which is not at all surprising. In this case, there's a very strong amplification signal from the wildlife trading section of a market in Wuhan. 31 of 33 environmental samples that were positive post-cleaning. I have to always say that they did clean out the entire place. It came from that western part of the market where the wildlife was housed. But you know, it's really not that important, because it's not about bat soups, civets, pangolins. It's not even about coronavirus that much, but it's all about interphases. So as you can see here, would be a road. It goes from A to B, but right and left of that road, you have wildlife, which is harboring quite naturally many pathogens, amongst them viruses. These circulate in wildlife. They do not cause disease. We keep talking about disease. It's not about disease. It's just potential pathogens. You put in that infrastructure, you're providing a spillover opportunity. And viruses will spill over into humans that are interacting on these edges of destruction. They'll be entering, you know, several hundred yards into that forest, and they will be reacting with their livestock as well. And as you put in some more infrastructure and roads, then you move that virus or that pathogen very quickly into large urban centers. And then from there, it's just a small hop to any old city anywhere in the world. So that's a really thing that's changed significantly since 2002 and 2003, is the interconnectedness of the world. Remember, it was estimated that some 900 people were traveling every month from Wuhan directly to New York City, and obviously many other places around the world. That's why these viruses are moving that quickly. I also want to make a really clear point. We know a lot about zoonotic diseases, and the zoonotic diseases that we know a lot about are not the ones that we're worried about. We're worried about the new pathogens, the emerging pathogens with properties we don't know. That's the problem with coronavirus, with this COVID. It's not about rabies. It's not about livestock zoonotic diseases we've known for hundreds of years. It's the new ones, the ones we know nothing about. And remember this, it's estimated there's some 700,000 viruses out there that have zoonotic potential. So we're not going to solve this with a vaccine. We're not going to solve this by addressing it some sort of high-risk species we've just come up with. It's really, we have to think about how we interact on these interfaces with our environment. Take those animals from the forest, pack them all together, keep them alive, and then move them across regions, across the globe, and stack them up in a market. The animals are alive. This is a key issue. You stack them on top of each other with domestic livestock. And this provides an absolute, and remember, these markets are huge industrial markets. They have nothing to do with providing food for local communities, for indigenous peoples or anything. These are industrial sized markets. These are status symbols. These are expensive ways of selling food. And they're specific, the live aspect of it is specific in Southeast Asia. Provide absolute perfect conditions for recombination events to occur. And that's how all the coronaviruses that have spilled over have occurred. They spill over because they recombine. You need to infect a live cell. Two viruses need to infect a live cell. It's really important to understand. Once it's dead or smoked or something, it's not that much of an issue. When it's alive, that's the issue. And we have no control of this, that's the point. And it's not only about the markets, it's about the whole trade chain as we move things through the trade chain. Recently, our research in Vietnam has shown that the positivity to coronaviruses in field rats increases from 1 in 5 rats at the site of capture across the wildlife trade chain. By the time it hits that restaurant kitchen, every second rat is positive for coronavirus. So it's in that kitchen where the highest risk is. So it's really important to understand, don't worry about the rat in the bottom, it's cooked, you can eat that, that's fine. Now, coronavirus and other spillover events are just a symptom for an ailing planet. And this has been pointed out, but it really reminds us of a very basic fact. Human health, animal, plant health, and environmental health cannot be divided apart. They are connected and we need to address these together. We need to address these in the One Health approach. And it also provides us an opportunity. It provides us an opportunity to really value and to further the value and stewardship for intact and healthy, resilient nature. It's really these frontiers of destruction where we're having it, beyond the obvious one that we're creating interfaces by bringing animals into a market. But it's these frontiers of destruction which we need to limit, and we need to limit that impact. So this is a common way of looking at a spillover event occurring. On the left-hand side, you will have the forests and the wildlife reservoir. You may have some vectors and spillover. So we like to work here. This is always the front line, the so-called front line. This is where we work. We document and try to note which viruses are out there. And that's important. Remember, within 2 weeks, we knew that the ancestral host this year from this outbreak was in a bat. But sometimes you have to question where the real front lines are. What is driving these changes, these edges of destruction? And that is something we really need to address. We need to be radical in the true sense of the word and address the root causes and stop glossing over those. I think this is really important. What can we do in the immediate future? We can obviously work and support countries to ban commercial trade in wildlife for consumption, especially in the large urban centers, especially in mammals and in birds. Obviously, this has to be recognizing the needs of indigenous people and local communities and their rights. And we need to strengthen One Health approaches. And just visit our dedicated webpage, and you can get more and more information from there. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Walzer. That was excellent. A good reminder of the interconnectedness of human and planetary health, which I find still challenging to get people to grasp in my line of work. Next up is our final panelist before Q&A. Dr. Lee Hanna is Senior Scientist for Conservation International and the Moore Center for Science. Dr. Hanna heads Conservation International's efforts to develop conservation responses to climate change and is a leading expert on climate change impacts on forests and waters. As an aside, his book with Tom Lovejoy, Biodiversity and Climate Change, was a prominent fixture in my office on the 7th floor of CIA headquarters. But today he'll highlight deforestation and the degradation of wildlife habitats as a driver of zoonotic spillover and pandemics. So over to you, Dr. Hanna.
Thanks, Rod, and thanks for hosting on this very important topic. Speaking personally, I never want to go through this again. And I think we can all agree that probably none of us want to go through this again if we can possibly avoid it. And we can avoid it. So you'll hear from me some of the same science that you've heard from Chris and Rebecca. And that's because the science on this is very well worked out, as Rod has pointed out. We've known about this for years. We just haven't acted on it. Now we're in the midst of really deeply understanding how damaging this can be. And so let's look at what we need to do to avoid it. First, let's look briefly at the history of pandemics. So in this infographic, deep time is in the distance 1,000 years ago, and the present is in the foreground. The giant virus-shaped blobs are different pandemics that have emerged through history. And the black line represents 150 years ago. So in the last 150 years, we've had about 8 major pandemics that have killed over 100,000 people. So one every 20 years or so. And about every other one of those is a sort of a super pandemic like HIV or COVID-19, where COVID-19 is headed, that kill over 1 million people. So all of those events obviously are events that we want to avoid. And the way those events come about is through virus spillover and emergence of disease. And that comes in wildlife markets, but it also comes in communities living with wildlife and living at the forest edge. And so I just want to go through a few images of those communities just to point out that these aren't evil people. These are just people living life at the forest edge, interacting with wildlife. And so while there's opportunities to point fingers here, we really need to realize that the things we have to do are just some lifestyle changes with folks who are living with wildlife. And those virus spillover disease emergence events come through direct contact with respiratory droplets or spit or blood of an animal. So they're very intimate contacts, and those are sorts of contacts that we understand the biosecurity and the health measures needed to avoid. So we want to work first, I think, at this virus spillover emergence frontier where diseases reach people. And we also want to work at the outbreak stage. Outbreak is where an emergence event reaches a number of people, but we're able to contain it, and that prevents it from becoming an epidemic where it affects an entire region, or a pandemic where it goes global. In order to prevent the next pandemic, then working at that emergence and outbreak level, which we don't do very much right now, and that's one of the reasons we're living through this pandemic, is we need to improve community, forest, and farm health at the forest interface. We need to reduce deforestation, to reduce those interactions between wildlife and communities and farms at the forest edge. And we need to stop trade in high-risk animals. There are some wildlife trade, game meat in Southern Africa, and others that aren't disease risk activities. But there are many other wildlife trade activities that are high risk, and we need to get those under control and stopped as much as possible. The good news is we know where to work. EID hotspots are emerging infectious disease hotspots for the types of viruses that cause pandemics. Those hotspots are all in the tropics. And we know that in 30 countries around the world, the greatest risk of infectious emergent diseases occurs. And in fact, 60% of the risk is in 10% of the tropical area. So we know well where to target, and what we need to do in those areas is improve community, forest, and farm health, which means doing community health clinics so that we can detect early emergence events. It means having healthier forests with less illegal activity going on in those forests. And it means taking some basic measures in farms to prevent viruses from moving from wildlife into farm animals or from farm animals into people. And then in the rest of the tropics, the other 90% of the tropics, we need to reduce deforestation to prevent new hotspots from emerging. We know that the virus transmission probabilities are highest where forest cover is most fragmented. And so we need to undertake some basic reduction of deforestation measures in the rest of the tropics. Now, these aren't cheap measures, but relative to the costs of a pandemic, they're a bargain. So as we go through the spectrum from emergence through to pandemic, there are various public health interventions, primary prevention and early detection. Those are things that we need to invest much more in. And then more traditional things of containment, which means contact tracing and testing, and mitigation, which means hospitalization. If you looked at how the US is spending money in the past decade, we spend very, very little on primary prevention and early detection. We spend a bit more on containment and mitigation, but as we're seeing every night in the news, we're not spending enough even on containment and mitigation. And as a result, then we have huge containment and mitigation bills, huge testing and hospitalization bills, and gigantic economic losses. It's worth noting that the green circles, which indicate our annual investments, and the gold circles, which indicate the costs we're experiencing just this year from COVID-19, are in different scales. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see the green circles, or else the gold circles would be bigger than the entire screen. So we've changed the scale here a little bit, but it makes tons of economic sense. And we just had a paper in Science looking at this that said it makes tons of economic sense to invest in primary prevention, those measures I mentioned earlier, and early detection in order to prevent big losses. So a sensible investment strategy might be to turn this around and make a large investment in preventing emergence, investing in community, forest, and farm health, a much bigger investment than we currently do in trying to arrest outbreaks, and then upping our investments in readiness in terms of testing and hospitalization for a net effect of greatly reducing the costs of pandemics, reducing the chance of pandemics, hopefully cutting pandemic risk in half, and as a result, having over the long term, much, much lower economic loss of life and social costs. So those investments that are needed to improve community, forest, and farm health. That requires people out in the field working with communities. That costs money. We need to reduce deforestation. That involves changing policies, but backing that up with improved enforcement and monitoring. That costs money as well. And then stopping trade in high-risk animals. We need to invest in shutting down trade that causes pandemics and huge cost to human and economic damages of pandemics. Those are the actions we need to take. We know what they are. The science is clear. Let's take those actions and save a lot of heartache and a lot of economic damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hanna. The economics of loss versus prevention and detection is staggering. So thanks again to all of our presenters today. So we'll continue now with Q&A. Again, for those online, please feel free to use the question submission box below the video player to ask any questions you may have. We'll do our best to get to all of the questions today, and if needed, we will follow up with the attendees with more info via email after the event if we can't cover it all. I'm going to throw out the first question. I think I'm going to direct it to Rebecca or Chris. Just in terms of how the US government responds when it comes to conservation-related investments towards preventing zoonotic spillover. What are they doing right? And what more should they be doing moving forward?
Yeah, I'll just start and then pass it over to Chris, if that's okay with Chris. The US government is doing a lot of things right. Through the International Biodiversity and Wildlife conservation programs implemented by agencies like USAID, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the State Department, and the US Forest Service, the government is helping to fund preventative efforts that address key drivers of zoonotic spillover. And this is very important. I think that the issue is, and it does really well where it invests. I think the issue is how much do we invest, and is it enough to prevent these spillovers? And it's just not. This funding amounts to less than 0.01% of the federal budget. And all told, the current US government investments to stop global deforestation and illegal wildlife trade amount to less than $500 million annually, compared to the trillions of dollars, as Lee was saying, the US is spending on COVID-19 response and the trillions lost in global GDP. These preventative efforts represent one of the best returns on investment we have for avoiding future pandemics. And so it's really worth having a robust conversation about the investment into avoiding these pandemics, and particularly given that a lot of these investments that need to be made upstream in the value chain, so at the deforestation front, in preventing the trade and sale and transport of live wild animals and the mixing of live wild animals with domestic animals. There are a lot of health benefits that not just avoiding pandemics, but other health benefits and other ecosystem service benefits of working upstream in the value chain of, of these live wild animals. And so I would just say we're doing some great things. We just need to expand it and make sure it's much more comprehensively focused on those zoonotic hotspots, emergence hotspots. And Chris?
Yeah, just I agree completely. Where the money is being invested, it's really well invested. It is at these front lines, at these edges of destruction, and it's really making a huge difference there. And so that's great. As you say, though, it's not enough. It's not in all the countries we were looking at in the tropics where we would need to invest in these front lines to prevent deforestation, limit deforestation, and improve the livelihoods of the communities there in an equitable fashion that doesn't also endanger them. And then the other thing where we're really lacking is in this prevention side of things. When you look at Predict 1 and Predict 2, this provided so much important information, which we're really, everything we know now in this extraordinary situation with the COVID-19, you mustn't underestimate how much we actually know. And that is based on a lot of this work on the prevention side of before the spillover. And we really need to get back into that field. And I think the US has a great opportunity to regain its leadership role there by increasing investments in the One Health arena and at that pre-spillover prevention area. So I think that's something as we move forwards where we really need to invest.
That's great. I'm going to go right to questions from the audience because we've got many already. And this is to Dr. Hannah. You referred to the need for, quote, lifestyle changes of people living with wildlife, unquote. Isn't that blaming the most vulnerable populations who are coming into contact with wildlife due to globalization and pressures leading to land use change, deforestation, and wildlife exploitation?
Yeah, well, that's exactly why I showed those pictures at the outset, was because we don't want to villainize people who are living marginally often at the forest's edge. And the lifestyle changes we're asking them to undertake are relatively minor and can be balanced with huge benefits in terms of community healthcare and on-farm improvements. So I think in balance, those forest communities, if we do this right, are winners in this situation. But we also do have to recognize that it's global patterns of consumption that are often driving deforestation. We need to both, stop the symptoms themselves, but we also have to stop in the medical analogy, we have to, make the lifestyle changes on the consumption end that reduce this. And many corporations are now interested in taking deforestation out of their supply chains. Many consumers, especially young people, are very concerned about taking care of the planet as they live their lives. So I think the elements are all in place, and we just need to scale up both in terms of our investments to prevent pandemics, but also in our efforts to do a better job of stewarding the planet and understanding the impacts of our lifestyles.
Great. We have another question, and this one is really on maybe food related. And it's maybe direct this at Chris, but we are seeing a world with increased population and diminishing resources, food and otherwise. This has led to increased human-wildlife conflict. What measures are there to address consumption of wild animals in the regions that we work in? And are there efforts to sensitize communities living in the forests and along the forest edges?
Yeah, so we see this always comes down, the population increase, but most importantly, when you look at population increase, you need to basically multiply that by GDP as well. And then that's when you see the real go. It's not the people actually, it's actually how much they're consuming and the wealth they're acquiring. So that's one thing just at the onset. Now, when we talk about food, we have to really differentiate. There's food for indigenous people and local communities that are dependent on forest meat, basically. And what's happening is that it's become a luxury item in many other markets. So we're draining those forests and limiting the access of these communities to to this forest and high quality food by moving it across the region into large cities, and where the consumption is not necessary. You have much cheaper protein and calorie sources there. So we really need to work on the behavioral changes as cities have changed. And this is one thing we really also have to understand clearly. This romantic idea that the person on the side of the road in northern Congo with a rat, he's gonna, if he sells that, it's going to be in a huge city within hours. That evening it will be eaten, someone may get infected, and the next day they're possibly already in a large city in Europe, in North America. And so the world has changed and it's interconnected. And also these communities in the forest are not disconnected from the world. So I think it is fair to ask for behavioral changes, small behavioral changes that will protect the planet. It's a global issue. And we need to stop this discussion all the time about you're putting the blame on the people in the forest. It's just the world has changed and that forest is close. You know, we need to get real. A bat virus is killing my neighbor here in the Bronx. It's very simple.
Great. Just another question here, and I'm not certain who might take it, but volunteer if you'd like to. Given the clear impact on national and international security, is this a proper issue for consideration by the UN Security Council? And if so, what kinds of actions might the UN Security Council take in response to the security risk?
I can start with that and then pass it over to the others. I think that that Chris talked about the One Health approach. I think it's really important to understand the One Health approach is an integrative approach, really trying to connect how we consume food and what we consume with health and with environmental degradation and loss. And it's this place where the disciplines and the agencies that are involved in actually implementing a One Health approach are really vast. And so having the Security Council actually pull these people together and truly take a One Health approach to understand the interconnectedness that Chris talks about is going to be incredibly important. This isn't the kind of solution that gets done with the tools we have already. It's a kind of solution that needs creativity and innovation in the context of our existing agencies and disciplines. It's really an exciting problem to try and solve. And I think we can solve it, but it really means we have to do things differently. The way we did things differently, say after 9/11. It's bringing together people and disciplines and expertises in ways we haven't done before so that we can implement solutions we already know are important, but also maybe find other solutions as well.
Any other speakers want to jump in on that? I can also move to the next question.
Well, that question speaks to international cooperation, and I think a key thing in international cooperation is making sure there's continuity of response on this. As we've talked about, we really need to scale up. It's going to cost billions of dollars, and if we do it one year and forget about it the next year, as we have with personal protective equipment supplies, the impact's going to be negligible. So there needs to be a concerted international effort with a recognition that this has to continue and just basically be a way that we change how we interact with the planet from here forward. And that requires something beyond just individual year by year political attention that things typically get.
And
yeah,
maybe if I could just add to that, Rod, just quickly, one of the things that's been really blatant in these last 6 to 7 months as we've been tackling this problem is how siloed some of the agencies still are and the coordinating. So I think the Security Council would have an option here to help the agencies that we already have to work much better together. Some of the agents have been quite slow at the pickup and understanding the complexities of what's connected. So there's some interagency coordination in a One Health perspective is really key. And we're seeing that at national level as well, of course, national and then at the international level.
Yeah, so let me just kind of follow up on that from another question from the audience, which in terms of the US government organization, is there utility in creating a new specific statutory category of funding, perhaps, quote, pandemic prevention program with a robust dedicated funding line with subcategories of funding aligned with the sequence of necessary measures?
Given the importance of nature in securing health of people globally, I think it would be a One Health approach that is necessary with pandemics, with a pandemic focus as part of a whole look at One Health. What we're seeing globally is that we are systematically destroying nature, and we're seeing the consequences of that and its impact on the health of communities and the health both in the developing country and in developed countries as well. So I think start with bringing the agencies together and through a statutory arrangement that really focuses on One Health, where they focus on pandemics, but a more robust look at One Health and the connection between the health of people and health of nature is going to be really important moving forward. Pandemics is one issue. We have other issues with that affect the health of people when nature is systematically destroyed and particularly systematically destroyed in the tropics.
Yeah, just maybe add to that, we do have some, there are some funding accounts already in the federal government, of course, which just need to be scaled up. That's the one side of the thing. We have, the US has a great reputation with the PREDICT and some of the projects they're talking about in the future. I think they need to be massively scaled up. And then as Lee had pointed out, this is a bargain. The return of investment is extraordinary. And the other thing is, of course, we need better interagency coordination. I'm seeing it at the state level. I live in New York, and I'm seeing how the state of New York is reaching out and saying, we need to talk about this because, we won't have a pandemic in New York, hopefully, but we're also seeing spillover events happening. How can we better coordinate between our various agencies to address that? And we need to do that on the federal level and on the international level as well. And there are some discussions ongoing there. And I think if we can get some traction and funding there, remember One Health is a great concept and a great framing, but we need to invest in operationalizing it and actually getting it to the ground so it actually can be implemented and brings a win situations for everyone.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that we're not talking about doubling existing levels of investment or something. We're talking about orders that, increasing by a factor of 10, or in some cases, perhaps a factor of 100, some of these activities. So from a legislative standpoint, yeah, we need to authorize those expenditures. We need to appropriate those expenditures. And then we need to be concerned about whether those appropriations are going to continue year after year. I think the better idea is to figure out what the US investment needs to be right now and get it authorized and appropriated right now when we're moving hundreds of billions of dollars because of the pandemic to get a solution in place as well as to address the damages.
Yeah, great. So a question for Lee. I wonder, so can you expand on forest fragmentation, why it's an important factor in zoonotic spillover? And are there fragmentation specific policies that might be pursued?
Yeah, definitely. And I think Chris gave a great example of this. Roads into forests is a prime example of fragmentation. When forests are highly fragmented, it's when we see the most spillover. So we just need to think about land use planning and what happens when you open roads up. Brazil, not at the moment the poster child of good forest management, but 5-10 years ago, Brazil had a very progressive program to reduce deforestation in the Amazon. They reduced deforestation between 50 and 70% at the same time that agricultural production went up in the region. So what we see is you can have great development at the same time you reduce forest fragmentation. And there's just a lot of forest fragmentation that goes on for really no constructive purpose that creates a lot of risk of pandemics.
Another question from the audience, maybe Rebecca, others, what are some things that farmers can do to reduce risk of transmission?
I think it's really important that you look along the value chain, region by region by region. Each region is very different in how it interacts with the forest and how it creates the risk of pandemics. But farmers, a lot of what we see in the developing countries is pastoralists that are feeding their family or local communities by having a few domestic wild animals interacting at the forest frontier. So those farmers need the support to intensify animal production, but not at the forest edge. There has to be the implementation of biosecurity measures across across the globe at the forest frontier. One of the things we should be thinking about, though, too, is the indirect driver of all of this is animal protein, the drive for increasing animal protein as part of the diet. We're going to see more and more farms at the forest edge, making sure that we have biosecurity measures while we're stopping deforestation, and also decreasing fragmentation will be really important. And as Lee said, countries have done that and are doing a really good job, and trying to implement those practices in multiple locations around the globe is going to be very important.
Another question from the audience, maybe Chris can take this. What about behavioral change for actors such as businesses causing commodity-driven deforestation or resource exploitation?
So I like to answer that, but obviously I'm not an economist. I'm a wildlife veterinarian. I could have done, I could talk a lot about farmers and what they should be doing, and biosecurity in Africa and Asia and things like that. But, you know, having now spent, 8 months of my life just looking at this, obviously, as we talk about these edges of destruction, they're not happening for some local region. There's no reason locally to pull in these roads. It's the indigenous people who are not particularly interested in that road per se. It's us and our consumption pattern and the extractive industries or trade along those roads. Or the timber we're pulling out of there. So corporations, in my view, have the greatest responsibility. We always talk about the Anthropocene, and that sort of implies that everyone is responsible in the same, me, yourself, my neighbor. It's not the same. There's a clear gradient of responsibility. Corporations are a lot more responsible for what's going on than everyone else out there. So we need to include those costs, these externalities, which have been cheap in the past. We need to include those costs. Nature is no longer cheap. Don't get that wrong. We've seen it with Corona. Climate change is here. Nature is expensive. We need to pay, and corporations need to pay, and be very clear that the externalities costs have to be agreed on and paid for in some form or fashion, and it has to redistribute some of this wealth which is being acquired.
And if I can jump in there,
Please.
The private sector and corporations, particularly food companies, are really paying attention to this. We've seen in the climate realm where you have really good science that develops really good metrics and a really good guide on how the private sector can engage in finance and in resource extraction and production. Companies can make commitments. They have the metrics to make those commitments and then to operationalize them. We need that same thing with respect to pandemics, avoiding pandemics, and with decreasing deforestation. And we see that companies are really engaging in that when they can make clear commitments and they have clear metrics that they can operationalize. And so a lot of our work right now is really working with the Science-Based Targets for Nature, SBTN, which is developing a full suite of metrics and goals, targets for companies to embrace to be a part of the solution, and companies are engaged. And so I think it's not companies alone that hold that responsibility. It's this connection with the NGOs have an important role to play. The governments around the globe have an important role to play, as and companies working together. And so I do think we're seeing many companies very concerned about the risks associated with the destruction of nature, because of their bottom line, but also because the risk of perception that they are the ones to blame.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists for this great conversation on global pandemics and the necessary steps we need to take to prevent the next pandemic. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. We hope you tune in again next Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time as the virtual briefing series goes live from Africa to provide a look into ongoing conservation efforts in Kenya and Namibia, where community-run conservancies supported by the United States government have led to recovering wildlife populations, economic growth and opportunities, better rural governance, and higher standards of living. Once again, thank you for joining.